The story goes as follows. Is it an earthquake, and its impact will start with the US as a people, as a country, as agenda, as their heritage, their culture? Are we going to witness a new United States of America, divided country, divided people, with a culture of hate, resentment, racism, Islamophobia, against everybody who's not with me, black and white agenda, no gray area? Is this where we are going with the United States of America? To where this will lead us with Europe? My understanding, Germany was the first country who convened the NATO with Obama, telling him we have to stand for our ethics, our values, our principles. Racism is not accepted, division is not accepted. We cannot accept this to go on. Is this going to build up on it? But for the region and for us, my understanding, we witnessed 4 major events recently. A meeting in Beirut for all the factions discussing the revisal and the reunity of the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which has been our embodiment for our national aspiration. Our guests worked very hard on this issue from day one, since the first Intifada. Where we go with this PLO back to the agenda? Is it true? Is it tactics? Is it genuine? Can it be translated to something real? Beirut meeting. And the second one, as far as I understand, Rome, Vatican recognizing the state of Palestine and opening an embassy, a flag, celebrating our presence in the heart of Europe, which is the Vatican. And this related in a way or another, whether I like it or not, to Muslim-Christian relationship. The other day we had the head of the churches in Jerusalem telling us very clearly, we don't share our churches. How come you are forced to church Al-Aqsa Mosque? This is an Islamic site since 1,400 years. No change of the status quo, respect, accept the status quo. No sharing of the churches, no sharing of the Muslim site. It has been there for 1,400 years. Can we translate this local church message through Rome to the Christian world? Yet to be seen after what happened in UNESCO. The third meeting, Paris, 70 countries, 2-state solution, freezing settlement, go back to negotiations. And yet, some Israeli voices said, how could you have such a meeting without the pride and the broom? My answer was, we are not married to the Israelis. We will never be with them in the same bedroom. We have been raped by the Israelis for the last 50 years. This has to be stopped. Is Paris conference a sign to bring back the ethics and the values, or to awaken the Israelis from where they are heading with this apartheid system in the making? I don't know. Yet to be seen. How can you translate whether we like the wording and the text of the Paris message? Can you translate it to reality on the ground? Especially with what is coming from Washington. And especially with Washington telling the Brits, go and veto anything at the United Nations Security Council till I go in as well to veto it.
So I'm going to talk about what I see as sort of strategic opportunities, and I want to, at least at the outset, mention 3 different strategic approaches. Though I'm going to speak primarily about the first of these, but I want to sort of put all 3 on the table. The first of them still accepts that the 2-state solution is a real possibility, and it still believes that ultimately it can be brought about through negotiations. And maybe it takes the perspective that that's the only way, in fact, that the conflict can be resolved, is through negotiations. So that's the one orientation. The second orientation basically says, look, we've had negotiations now since 1993, so that's 17 plus 16, 17, what is that? Over 30 years? No, I'm sorry. 22. It's 22 years, 23 years. Okay. That's longer than the space of time between the end of World War I and the end of World War II. I mean, that's just think of all that happens in world history in such a period of time, and this is what's happened since the PLO, the Palestinian people, basically ceded the most fundamental issue in the conflict, which is recognizing Israel's right to exist, which was done first in '88 and then second on the White House lawn, repeated in 1993. And you would have thought that it wouldn't have taken 5 years that Oslo talked about to end the conflict, but maybe 9 months at that point. But they got into a slow process, step by step, that was a 5-year process. And now we've gone on for 24 years. It's an absurdity, and it has worked out to be basically Shamir's idea, which is I'm going to drag out the negotiations for a decade and put 1 million settlers in the territories, and there'll be the facts on the ground which will resolve the whole thing. So that perspective basically says negotiations are a farce. They've proved that they can't go anywhere. They won't go anywhere. There's nobody on the Israeli side. And instead, it goes to unilaterally creating the Palestinian state. And then the third perspective is one that says, no, it's the two-state solution actually is over. We're past that. The only thing actually is there is a one-state solution, and it's not for the future, it's already here. We have one state that for a half a century has controlled all of the territory from the river to the sea. It's been maintaining a fiction that it's not one country by these negotiations. But actually it is one country under the rule of one government, only it's vastly unequal. And what's needed is to face up to the fact that it is one country and then to launch a process for equality, democracy inside of that one country. So those are the three broad orientations that I see, and maybe there are more, but those are the three. And I want to just say a little bit more about the second one, since I'm actually identified primarily with it, but I'm not going to talk about it today. What I want to do is just to set in a little bit of context. And it also will help in thinking about the history here, but it's also an indirect way I want to get to express some appreciation for Passia and Mahdi. And I just want to read you a page or so from an article that was published in Al-Quds in April of 1988. So the Intifada was 4 months old at the time, and I went into Al-Quds and I sat down with someone who was in an editorial capacity, and I asked them if I told them who I was, and I asked them if they'd be interested in my publishing something in the paper, and they said very much so. It turned out that person was Saeb Erekat, who was working there, and that's when I met him. I didn't know what the future would hold. So, but this is a little bit from that piece at the time, and it's about strategy. And I wrote, it's time to rethink some of the basic premises. Up to now, Palestinians have placed tremendous import on an international conference, negotiations, and PLO representation at such negotiations. Not much is heard about what happens if such negotiations begin and then deadlock. Perhaps it is believed that the price of failure would be so great that once started it would necessitate a comprehensive solution. Yet this is wishful thinking. It's perfectly likely that the negotiations will simply be unable to generate a solution acceptable to both Israelis and Palestinians. And it is also unlikely that the superpowers will lack the will, or it's also likely that the superpowers will lack the will to impose a solution. If we probe a bit deeper, we see that the present strategy for attaining an independent Palestinian state embodies a model which needs to be challenged. That model is that statehood emerges from negotiations and agreement. In short, it assumes that no Palestinian state can come into existence unless there is prior Israeli approval. Yet consider how Israel itself came into existence. Following the United Nations Partition Resolution of 1947, the Israelis simply declared the existence of the State of Israel. Indeed, they made that declaration contrary to the urging of the U.S. State Department. They did not get Arab or Palestinian advance approval. They did not negotiate with the Palestinians. They proceeded unilaterally and gradually secured international recognition, admission to the United Nations, and effective control of territory. There are important analogies and disanalogies here for the Palestinians. today's military and political realities totally preclude achieving statehood through force of arms. But on the other hand, today's political, moral, economic, and social and psychological realities offer new alternatives within the same basic concept. The Palestinians do not need advance Israeli approval to bring a state into existence, and there's no reason why they should cede such power to Israel. Indeed, to do so is inconsistent with the underlying spirit of the uprising. The term intifada hadn't yet even come into existence at that time. The alternative strategy is possible. An alternative strategy is possible, one which overnight will transform the political agenda and place a two-state solution at center stage as the only peace option. Here's how it might proceed. And I gave 10 points, and I'll just mention 2. 1, the PLO issues a declaration of independence and statehood, announcing the existence of the state of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza. Simultaneously, the Declaration of Independence and statehood is announced throughout the territories. And 2, the PLO proclaims as its final act its transformation into the provisional government of the State of Palestine. The Palestinian National Council, the PNC, is transformed into the legislative body of the provisional government. All governmental positions are declared provisional, pending the possibility of free elections by the Palestinian people. And then I went on to, a dozen more pieces. And this was, as I say, in April. In and around, at the end of July, King Hussein issued his famous withdrawal of Jordanian responsibility and claims of authority and so on. And at exactly that moment, the Shin Bet raided the offices of Faisal Husseini and found some documents there that were a plan to issue a Declaration of Independence, which became known as the Husseini document. And it wasn't known, and the document at first wasn't released, just the existence of it. But information came out about it. And a reporter, my piece had been published in Al-Quds, and then it had been reprinted actually in the Washington Post and in the International Herald Tribune. So it was widely known, especially in Washington circles. And there was a reporter from an Israeli paper, Mariv, in Washington, and she saw the relationship between some of the ideas, not all of them, and it remained some important differences between the Husseini document and what I wrote. But she saw enough of the similarities and didn't see the differences, I think. And Mariv wrote a headline that said, Jewish professor, author of Husseini document, because nobody here had been identified as that because it was secret, and the person who wrote the Husseini document would be arrested and so forth. Well, in any event, it became a very big thing. And the Israeli press got excited about it, loved the idea that, a good Jewish boy who grew up in the Bronx was, in their words, the Herzl for the Palestinians and so on. And the New York Times, wrote stuff about Jewish father, a Palestinian state, a lot of, talk, right? But understandably, it created a certain amount of resentment here because the Intifada, of course, was the real thing. That was the process of state creation. And it was in that context, and then I turned my article into a book, which I published in English called Creating the Palestinian State, A Strategy for Peace. And then I attended the 19th PNC, in which the declaration, which was written by Mahmoud Darwish, and was different in many ways from both the Husseini document and the specifics of my proposal, but in some ways similar. But anyway, then I came back here. And Mahdi hosted me to give a roundtable talk about either the declaration, past, present, and future, and so on, which I did at Passia. And then subsequently, as he mentioned, he helped me get a translation of my book into Arabic, and then Passia published it. And he did that in a way that was, straightforward. And it was in the context, as I say, of a certain amount of resentment, and people say, well, don't emphasize this Jewish guy, and so on. And I just never had an opportunity to publicly thank him previously for his role in this, and I just wanted to say that. So thank you, Mahdi. Now, let me say a word about Trump. first of all, people, want to know what's Trump's policy going to be. Anybody who tells you what it's going to be doesn't know what he's talking about, because there is no Trump policy. You have to imagine sort of a head that there's nothing inside of it that has anything to do with policy. There's stuff inside of it. It's not just he doesn't have policy on the Middle East. There are no policy commitments. There's no ideology in there. On this issue, at the beginning of the campaign, we had all of these Republican midgets on that stage there, right? And they all went trotting off to Las Vegas to meet with Sheldon Adelson and to kiss his ring as if he was the Pope and so on, but basically to get campaign contributions and so on. Trump was the only person who didn't go out there, and at that stage said some things about, I'd like to be the honest broker, and you have to, and we'll see, and so on. But it was remarkably encouraging that this guy didn't join this procession. But then, of course, as it became more possible that he was actually going to win the nomination, he flip-flopped and he gave a speech at AIPAC that the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. participated in the writing of that speech, Ron Dermer, with Trump's son-in-law. And then he talks, as we know now, about maybe about moving the embassy and so on. But at the same time, he still keeps talking about this is the ultimate deal. And the reality about Trump, the only thing that's real about him, is that he is a deal maker. I read a little bit of his book called The Art of the Deal, and it is remarkable his way of life. He gave the first chapter was about how he spends each day of a week. And he talks about making 150 phone calls every day. And every one of those phone calls is about a different deal. There's 150 balls up in the air, and it's global. It's New York City, it's Atlantic City, it's Indonesia, it's Australia, and so on, in one day, right? And he wrote this book 30 years ago. He was never thinking about being president. This is who he is. So the only thing I could say about Trump, though, that is important from a strategic point of view, is that Palestinians should try to move him into the identity that he aspires to, which is to be the deal maker. And he knows, actually, and has said at certain points, that to do that effectively, you actually do have to be the honest broker. Now, he may not be as honest as one would appreciate, but it's important. It's really quite important that he be moved into that space where he comes to believe that a deal is really possible. Now, you've got one thing going against him, which is, of course, the failure, among other things, of John Kerry. And if anybody else had been elected president, nobody else would touch the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a 10-foot pole. And they would see the failure of Kerry on top of the failure of the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, Jimmy Carter, and so on, as the textbook lesson of the mistake that presidents make of investing their presidential capital, time, and energy in the quicksand of this conflict, which in international terms, in their view, has gotten of less and less importance anyhow. So no one would touch this with a 10-foot pole. The only thing that counteracts that is that Trump looks at all these people and he says, what do they know about making a deal? I am the only person who really knows how to make a deal. So it is possible, despite all experience, and he won't listen to anybody else. So Tillerson will tell him, this is a mistake, let's focus on something else or attend something else. But if he thinks a deal is possible, I think it's like a giant magnet, because he doesn't really care about policy, actually. If you asked him, I think, what would you view as a success of your presidency? Actually, if he ended up making this deal, that would be the main thing, and he could go home happy, and so on. So that's sort of there. Now, there's another thing about Trump, that's the meaning of Trump, and it's very interesting. It's that Trump is a catalyst to something amazing, and we're going to see the fact that Trump, the American president, is the most powerful person in the world, right? The fact that the United States picked, of 350 million people, this empty man, this crude man, this man who has no respect for institutions and so on, and anointed him the most powerful person in the world, is actually a world historical event, almost as if the gods in a Greek tragedy or comedy were making fun of humanity and were bored with what happens on the planet, and says, you know, almost like in the book of Job, but there at least there was an issue, but just for their own amusement said, let's make the most absurd human being the most powerful human being on the world, and let's see what happens. Well, one of the things that is happening actually is that an appreciation of this event is dawning on the world, and we're going to see the day after Trump is inaugurated, in the United States, a million women are coming to Washington to protest one day into his presidency. And we're going to see demonstrations in 500 cities in the United States and events around the world before it even gets started. And what's happening is that there's a release of creativity that is occurring and energy to do something about this. And I think that that has to do with a decision to make this happen out of Trump. And I think the Palestinians can do the same thing. If you go back and think about what was happening here during the Intifada, with the energy and creativity that we saw in the first Intifada, I think the arrival of Trump, if you define it as this, can be used for an outpouring of Palestinian creativity when you combine that with the half-century anniversary of the occupation that's coming up next June. I think those two things together are an opportunity for a tremendous release here of new energy, new thinking, and new behavior. So now I want to go on and talk about the primary thing that that I have in mind, which really has to do with sticking with the negotiations strategy. And I would say a couple of things about this. First of all, in the quarter of a century almost of negotiations that we've actually only had a very limited experience with real negotiations over final status. We didn't get them until, we had sort of the Camp David Taba period for, let's say, 9 months, if we go back a little bit before that, under Barack. And then we had serious negotiations between Olmert and Abu Mazen. And that's really it. I mean, we had something, but it wasn't serious negotiations under Netanyahu. So the actual period in which there was a deliberate attempt in that quarter of a century to resolve in negotiations the final status issues, I'd say just time-wise, probably less than 2 years under two distinct presidencies and two different chairmen of the PLO. So it's much less negotiating experience than one often thinks, unless you see it that way. Secondly, I would say that remember that this is a conflict between the two peoples. Okay, it's not a conflict between the PLO and the government of Israel. It's a conflict between the two peoples, between two nationalisms, and ultimately the audience for the Palestinians and Palestinian policies has to be the Israeli people. And it'll be the Israeli people because they're a democracy, among other things, that will choose the government and will choose the people in the Knesset who will have to ratify a treaty in any event. And you won't be able to reach an agreement until you get a different government in Israel in any event. So the target has not got to be Netanyahu and so on. It's got to be always thinking about the Israeli people. And I would say this gives almost sort of a simple way of thinking about what the outline of a strategy would be, just in terms of two principles, to my mind. One is, as people are very familiar with, there can be no cost-free occupation. But we can talk very importantly about what we mean by cost, okay? But obviously, if there's no cost to the occupation, it just becomes very comfortable, and there are many reasons why it will simply go on forever. Okay. At the same time, I would say the most fundamental thing that needs to be articulated and again is that peace has to be credible. That is, the Israeli public have to believe that real peace is really possible. And here you have to make a very strong distinction between a peace agreement and real peace. They're very different things. And I researched this. We did a big study, which came out in a book called Negotiating Jerusalem, but it was broader than that, of Israeli, and then we did with Palestinian partner, of Palestinian attitudes. And we asked Israelis, this is in 1995, at the height of Rabin's popularity, 2 years into Oslo. And we asked Israelis whether or not they thought that successful negotiations would result in lasting peace. And that 2/3 of Israeli Jews said no, that they didn't think that negotiation success would give you lasting peace. Okay? Well, if you don't believe that negotiations success will give you lasting peace, then you're not losing the possibility of lasting peace if you have in place a government like Netanyahu who's not really serious about the negotiations. You're not losing real peace, you're just losing the piece of paper, which explains one of the big paradoxes, which is why consistently do Israelis poll left? That is, when you ask the Israeli public their views about the two-state solution, about the Geneva Accord, and so on, they always end up giving you a left-wing majority. And then they go to the polls and they vote a right-wing government. How do you explain that? And to me, the basic explanation is that they don't believe that a right-wing government actually is causing them to lose the opportunity of peace because they don't think a peace agreement will give them that. And you have, among other things, everybody's forgotten about it, but you may remember, Israel once had a peace treaty with Lebanon, right? There was a signing ceremony, right? A real treaty between Israel and Lebanon. And no one even remembers it. It was so irrelevant to changing the relationships between Israel and Lebanon. So I would say there's always this. Now, it's very simple. So you've got these two things, right? No cost-free occupation. And on the other hand, with respect to every tactic and every strategy, you have to put it to a litmus test. Does this make peace more credible or less credible? Well, it turns out that in reality, it's proved for Palestinians extremely difficult, actually, to do both of those things at the same time. That the choice of tactics for making it no longer a cost-free occupation can be tactics that fail the simple litmus test. Are you making peace more credible or less credible? And so one of the things that's being talked about now, and I won't mention his name, but I had a conversation yesterday. I just about fell off my chair with one of the most prominent Palestinian peacemakers and one of the most creative ones, and was talking to him about, what might Palestinians do going forward. And he said, well, it's time really to end security cooperation. And I couldn't believe it. He said, well, we won't promote terrorism, but we won't stand in the way of it either. Okay. Well, yes, that would in fact end the cost-free occupation like the Second Intifada did. The Second Intifada, among its many impacts, destroyed the Israeli left. Right? It allowed Israelis to talk about the Oslo criminals. Right? So the idea is that if you focus in a one-sided way on one of these principles and forget about the other, things will just be completely undone here. Because the Israelis, if they don't believe that peace is really possible, and you do raise the cost of the occupation, they're not going to withdraw and allow a Palestinian state to emerge here that is not committed to peace. And what Hamas has demonstrated, actually, is that while a Palestinian state in the West Bank won't be an existential threat, nonetheless, it can make life impossible for Israelis if you've got, let's say, mortars exploding a few miles away on the Ben Gurion airport. One mortar, or rocket, as it were, that landed a mile from Ben Gurion airport caused the United States to issue a warning that American planes should not fly to Tel Aviv. One rocket. Okay, so just imagine if there was a hostile state that was based here. So you would make life impossible. But the Israeli response to that ultimately is going to be what we saw with the Second Intifada: counter-violence, legitimized because they've already gone through the some sort of process, statehood, unilateral withdrawal, whatever people think. But basically, the violence would be beyond what we saw. And in any event, historically, Jews, the one thing that we have is an unbelievable capacity to absorb pain. So, cost-free, one has to think about how do you inflict costs or maintain costs that are consistent with peace being credible. In fact, how do you sometimes make peace more credible? And I'm running short on time, so I just want to mention, and I'll just mention them, what I would call game changers, okay? API. Okay, API is a wonderful idea, right? Normalization with the Arab world. The problem is the API came too late. Right? What do I mean by too late? It came after Sadat, after the treaty with Jordan, after the treaty with Egypt. Imagine the API if it came before that and said, you want peace with the Arab world, you want peace with Egypt, make peace with the Palestinians. After that, Israel already had a very robust treaty with Egypt, had a peace treaty with Jordan, and today Syria is no more. Saddam Hussein's Iraq is no more. Exactly what does the APA, in terms of Israeli security, put on the table? The game changer is getting Iran to endorse, in a clear-cut, robust way, the API. Now, if Israel's relationship with Iran are dependent on them making peace with the Palestinians, then you have a whole new thing. Then real Israeli national security interests are involved, and national security interests of the United States are involved, because the Israeli game plan, which Obama thwarted, is to pull the United States into a war with Iran. And that game plan is still in place, and that's real. That clock is ticking. So, now, even if you can't get Iran to do that, just having the Palestinians be the prominent leader of the movement to get Iran to stand behind the Palestinians by joining the APA, the API puts the Palestinians in an incredible place. It means that the Palestinians are, in fact, engaged in trying to do something that affects national security interests of both Israel and the United States big time. They're suddenly a world player by playing this role. And you can develop a very powerful strategy for, in fact, affecting Iran. I won't go into it, but that's an area for creative thinking. How, in fact, can you force Iran to do this, or shame them, or cause them to suffer a price if they don't join it? So that's one game changer that's worth thinking about. A second thing is a new kind of peace process. Now, we know what the existing thing has looked like in the past, and we know there's been all this talk about parameters. Okay, I think it's time to leapfrog parameters and do something different. And I've talked about something called UNSCOP 2. UNSCOP was the only time the international community actually developed a detailed plan and a map for resolving the conflict. It happened once in the history of the conflict. And it was the most important thing that the United Nations ever did vis-a-vis this, was the partition resolution. We could have UNSCOP 2, but there are all sorts of problems with that and so on, and I've written about it and so on. You could have also something that takes an existing thing like Geneva and call it a 9-month Geneva process. I'm not saying impose it. UNSCOP 1 was an imposed solution. But I'm saying use a detailed treaty as a jumping off point for negotiations. In other words, have a detailed treaty that just needs to be signed, put on the table for 9 months, have the two parties come together to see if they can come up with mutually acceptable amendments to that. After 9 months, they have to say yes, no, or put it to a referendum of their people. And we'll have decision time, and then we'll know the negotiations is possible or not possible. Now, my current proposal for this is a little bit different, and it fits with this thing of pulling Trump into the mix, okay? I would have the Arab states, maybe Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, publicly call on Trump to, consistent with the Arab Peace Initiative, because the Arab states are not going to modify the API and turn it into something with full details and substance. That's off the table. But to call on Trump to, consistent with the Arab Peace Initiative, draft a detailed treaty that just needs to be signed, and then call on Israel and the PLO to spend 9 months negotiating with that as the basis, and then let's see what happens. So that would be a very big game changer, and maybe the Israeli government would say no. But if it says no and the PLO says yes, we've changed the whole narrative as to who's standing in the way, and we've moved the API into incredible prominence. And then, of course, if that's coupled with a PLO or Palestinian effort to bring the Iranians in as endorsers of the API, then it takes on global significance. So these two things really work together. Okay. Third idea is some new thinking about final status, right? Everybody says we know all the answers. Okay, that's crazy. That really is crazy. There's so much potential creativity and so many things that, were problematic about the answers. But I would offer one thing that I've written to some extent about and so on, and it's called the common homeland approach. And among other things, I'll just say one little bit about it, which is that it becomes an alternative to asking the Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. It starts out basically with a joint affirmation by both Israel and the PLO, and it's a joint affirmation that affects the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And what it says is, to a certain extent, it says, no, Israel is not, as it were, the homeland of the Jewish people. It says something different. It says all of the land between the river and the sea is the common homeland of both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. And so it says that the Palestinians who are living inside of Israel are living in their own homeland. They may be living in Israel, they may be living in something that's a Jewish state, but you can't tell them that you're not living in your homeland, and so go somewhere else. Okay? At the same time, it speaks to the people who feel in Israel who quite accurately tell you that read the Bible and answer this question, right? Where were the major population centers of the Jewish people that are in the Torah? And they were in Hebron and in Jerusalem and in Nablus and so on. They're in the hill country. And so they say, the homeland is elsewhere. On the other hand, you say there have to be two states in the interest of peace. But then you move into a very different way of thinking about the relationships between the two states. And rather than strict separation, you have a pledge, actually, for to the maximum extent possible, to have there be respect for the fact that this is the common homeland of the two people. And Israel becomes something that's more open for the Palestinians and for the Palestinian refugees. And similarly, there's a way in which the territories are more open to Israeli citizens. But that becomes negotiations of policy between the two states. It doesn't even have to be resolved in negotiations. That becomes the living policy issue that's worked out over the next century of relationships between the two states. And we have experiments. Some things work, some things don't work, and so on, and ebb and flow like trade policy. Okay. Fourth.
Final note.
Okay, I'll say two other things. One word. RPI. We have the API, you get to the refugee section, and it's just garbage, right? It's just the empty words. Fair solution based on 194 means nothing or means totally different things depending on who's spinning the thing. What we've never had in the history of the conflict is the refugees themselves coming forward and saying what they would accept as resolution of the conflict. And ultimately, I don't believe the conflict can be resolved unless the refugees believe that they've achieved at least some form of what Arafat used to call relative justice. But the refugees have never said what that is. Total game changer in making peace credible if the refugees themselves come forward with what they're talking about. And finally, I would say something that people won't like to hear, I think, which is that to make peace credible, let's do peace education now. Let's bring together, in every stage of their education, Israeli children with Palestinian children from elementary school through college, and let them talk to each other about the experiences, about their narratives. You've got a narrative that is a lot in it that Israelis need to know and need to hear. And you should be going for an opportunity to teach that to the next generation of Israelis. And Israelis have got things that they've got to say to the next generation of Palestinians. Making that peace education possible now is something that will make lasting peace credible. That's my fifth game changer. Okay, thank you very much.
It raises by itself when I start speaking. First, I must note, as a Palestinian American, an American citizen born in Ohio, it's very embarrassing to be an American today. So this is a platform which allows me to have a closed discussion with many friends. So this is helpful to my therapy. The other note that I would like to make up front, and it's similar to the one Jeremy made, is I was asked to come to give some reflections about Trump and the Palestinian strategy. And I focused a lot on reflections, because anyone who believes that they have enough information to do an analysis or has enough track record of this person to be able to actually predict, I think is lying. So what we can provide is reflections based not only on the person, but on the state that the person represents, which I think is the more interesting discussion. I'll get to that in a second. Ironically, the Trump win is very similar to the Hamas win in terms of him being a minority president, not receiving the popular vote majority, and coming forward because mainly of a protest vote. And I think the Electoral College, the electoral system, somebody's phone can't be stopped, the Electoral College and the protest vote together is what brought Trump to the forefront. Definitely it wasn't his party because he alienated himself from his party. And definitely it wasn't the constituencies which make up usually the voting blocks. Women, Hispanics, African Americans. He basically burned bridges with all of those constituencies. And that's one of the reasons why the polls got it wrong. Polling in America is a very, very sophisticated industry. However, the basis of that industry is based on demographics. So they calculate clusters of people and they kind of extrapolate from those clusters. There's an excellent article, I'll refer you to. It came out last week in the Huffington Post from a professor, he's a retired professor, George Lakoff. He wrote an article, it's a long one, an analysis, it's called The Minority President. And he goes through very systematically why and how Trump won. Because what he's reflecting, as Jeremy said perfectly, is not depth of policy or an articulation of policy, but rather he's representing a shift in the value system in the US, which is cross-cutting across the various clusters. This is an important dynamic to keep in place. The US is changing. Similar to how we've seen during the last decade, Israel changing. It's not about Netanyahu. It's about a community which has changed to be able to elect Netanyahu so many times. And that's something to keep in mind as well. To address the topic tonight of Trump and Palestinian strategy, I first want to just make a note so we can start kind of structurally. What is the Palestinian strategy, if there is one? I would claim there is a strategy. And I don't believe the talk that we are lost and we are in a jungle and we have nowhere to go and we're just waiting for things to come together with the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation so we can get our act together. I don't believe that. I don't buy into that. I think the Palestinian side over time has developed a very concrete strategy, and it revolves around the following. 1, 2 states. 2 states is a clear strategy of the Palestinian leadership, and not only this Fatah-run leadership in the West Bank, but the PLO leadership ever since 1988, and I would actually go back to 1974. It's not where the Palestinian movement started. The Palestinian movement, after a decade of shock after 1948, started with the thinking around 1 state. But even that is kind of needs some analysis, because we've been programmed to think that there's only 2 solutions to this conflict, a 1-state solution or a 2-state solution. Who says? Who says? There's 1 state and there's flavors to that. There's 2 states and there's flavors to that. But there's parallel sovereignty, there's common homeland, there's federation, there's confederation, there's a parallel sovereignty, there's a condominium arrangement. I don't know why they call it political science. They should call it political art. The Palestinian side has rested on a two-state solution, not out of a sole desire to choose, as if we're walking into a restaurant and choosing from a menu, but rather it came about because of the PLO's alignment with international law as being the framework, the ultimate parameters to a solution with the Israeli side. And that set of parameters, which are embedded and codified in international law, calls upon the Palestinian side to align with two states. That's the first part of our strategy, and it's not new. The second is, and this came after 20 years of failed negotiations, via a bilateral negotiation process called Oslo. What has ended is not the Palestinian desire to negotiate. If we had, and I'll get to that in a second, if we had a better communication team, negotiations for or against should not even be a question asked. Ultimately, we will negotiate. If I didn't think that was the fact, I'd be putting a hat around and gathering some funds to be able to buy our first F-16. You either negotiate or you impose by military force a reality. We don't have the ability to force a reality, so we will ultimately negotiate. But that's a vague term. How will we negotiate? After 20 years, thankfully, the Palestinian leadership finally said no more bilateral negotiations, and that takes us to the third pillar of the strategy, which is not internationalizing the conflict. The conflict was international at birth. It took it back to the international fora to be able to say, basically, we have failed. And that was the strategy of 2011, prior to that UNESCO, then 2011, when we went into the General Assembly, we went into the Security Council and requested membership in the UN. And as you all well know, the US looked at us and said, you better not. If you bring this to vote, we will veto it. 20, 25, 30 years ago, the Palestinian side would have probably said, so what? We're bringing it anyway to embarrass you, US. But we've become sophisticated in our politics. In 2011, when we were challenged by this veto, we basically said, okay, we won't bring it to vote. Let's put it in a Security Council committee. And that's where it sits today. We waited 1 year. During that year, settlement building was accelerated like never before. 2012, we bring the resolution to the General Assembly calling for statehood. And basically, I highly recommend, if you haven't already done so, even if you've done so, do it again. Read the resolution itself. The resolution is 100% aligned with US policy. It says, two states, based on the 1967 border. That's something I wouldn't have done if I was them. There's no reason to negotiate unilaterally. We could have said on the 1967 border, but that was a concession given up front, yet again. We don't learn our lessons easily. And it also talks about the need to negotiate the shared border. That approach to the General Assembly resulted in what? 138 countries saying yes, 9 saying no. You know the 9, right? The US, Israel, the Czech Republic, Canada, Panama, the superpower of Micronesia, the superpower of Palau, and the superpower of the Marshall Islands, and the superpower of Nauru. That's where the US put itself. The significance of that move was not to flutter in front of the community of the international world and say, see, we were right. The world community is with us. I'm sure we did a little bit of that with that huge chair that was in Ramallah, if you saw it while you were here. What's more important is that with those 138 votes came a new toolbox to the Palestinian side. And when we opened up the toolbox, there were tools that we didn't understand. You can now become an International Criminal Court member. You can actually enter into, I don't know what it is, 522 different treaties, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, we had to learn how to act like a state. So we tried our luck. And we started to enter international treaties and venues. And as you know, during the 2011 UNESCO move, the US side immediately, when we became a full member, knee-jerk reaction, because the Clinton administration had already legislated this. The knee-jerk reaction was what? If any UN venue accepts the PLO or Palestine as a full member, the US will cut funds off of that organization. I guess at the time it was 35% of UNESCO's budget was coming from the US. So all of a sudden the Palestinian leadership is getting calls from countries in sub-Saharan Africa and other places saying, what are you doing? Somebody in Kenya didn't get a book this week because you decided you wanted to become a member in the UN. So I think the Palestinian side slowed down and said, hey, this is a very powerful tool, but we need to watch how we use it, because we can alienate ourselves from our own allies if we don't use it wisely. And I think the leadership actually then started to very slowly act, and actually is using it as a reaction to some of the movement that's happening from the US side. So when things don't happen in the international community, which is I think what will happen if he moves the embassy, if Trump moves the embassy, they're not going to attack because we have no capacity to attack. They will enter more and more UN venues, putting the US into a bind because legislation-wise, they will have to stop funding those agencies. When you stop funding agencies, you start to have less leverage in those agencies. So that's going to be a very messy period of time. Back to the UN Fora was the third pillar of what I would claim is our strategy. The fourth part of our strategy is nonviolence. And I believe it has been articulated systematically from the highest levels of the Palestinian leadership. When I say nonviolence from the officialdom. Nobody has control on individual acts of violence. And very few people, especially the PA leadership today, with its very limited legitimacy from a popular perspective, is able to control civil society's acts, which may turn out to be violent. But the officialdom, what the PA has under its realm of control, has been systematically nonviolent. And as Jeremy mentioned, it's not only nonviolent, it's in security cooperation to make sure they do all they can to make sure the other components of the society remain so. So we do have a strategy. That strategy, codified in international law, I would call the parameters. Since parameters is a very sexy term, and Clinton did it, and now Kerry did it, I think we need to rephrase what parameters means in this conflict, and it's back to UN parameters, which are codified and accepted by the entire international community, and that's part of the value of UN Resolution 2334. Unanimously, there is a confirmation that the parameters of the UN apply to us, mainly that this is a military occupation. And I think that should not be taken lightly. The crisis, in my opinion, on the Palestinian strategy side, remember, I'm trying to scope out our strategy, is in implementation. There's a weakness, there's an inherent weakness in our ability to communicate it and to act proactively politically. It seems, I'm not in the PA, I never was, but from an observer perspective, it seems the mode of operation of the Palestinian leadership, the current Palestinian leadership, is to be overly cautious and wait for others to make mistakes. That works because others make mistakes. But when others make mistakes, they usually repair those mistakes on our behalf and continue to go forward. So waiting for some kind of critical mistake to be done, like Trump moving the embassy, thinking that's going to spill over into some kind of resolution or progress from our strategy perspective, I think is a misnomer. We have to become proactive within the terms of our parameters. So that's the strategy. In addition to the strategy, as Dr. Mehdi mentioned, I think we cannot discuss this with Trump-Palestine without taking in the ecosystem that we're currently living in. And very quickly, I'll just run down them because I believe we're all aware of them. We don't understand them maybe, but aware of them. The regional collapse. The regional collapse cannot be underestimated. States work on interests, not on deal-making, not I love Putin and we're going to kiss and go play golf. They work on interests. Palestine strategically does not have the kinds of interests that make other countries deal with us in a more serious way. Israel does. So the issue of us losing our Arab depth is strategic in a negative sense to us. And currently, even though we have probably thousands of problems with Jordan and with Egypt, we have no option but to remain in some kind of alliance with those two countries because the rest of the Arab world doesn't exist for the most part. And Saudi Arabia as well would be a third one. The other ecosystem issue is our disunity. I think disunity is overrated. Yes, I want unity, but yes, that's an internal Palestinian issue. We have to solve it. And the international community should, I think, slow down on the issue of we can't do anything now unless there's unity. I come from the US. Disunity there was called civil war, and blood fell before it became unified. Hopefully we won't go that far, but it is a domestic issue that we have to solve. In the meantime, the international community has its address for Palestine. It's sitting at the UN with the majority of the countries of the world recognizing it. There's no lack of address if you, as a third state, want to get involved with Palestine. So that's the disunity issue is an important one, but it shouldn't be the showstopper for progress. Lack of popular legitimacy for the Palestinian Authority, a key issue. There is no vacuum, in my opinion, in politics. No vacuum whatsoever. Where there's a vacuum, somebody will fill it. So yes, Abbas has entered his 12th or the 13th or 14th year of a 4-year term. He is still officially, legitimately, from a political level, the leader in charge. Does he have popular legitimacy amongst our people? It's probably this big right now. But again, it's the political legitimacy which should be interest of third states. I can mention many states around the world who don't have popular legitimacy for their leaders. Trump would be a good one to mention, right? The minority president. The other point I would make, and this is a very, very important one to me, and I'll come back to it at the end of what I'm going to say, is it is laughable that the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, and the PLO, after 70 years, actually 50 years, have not invested in the infrastructure to be able to make our case. Not from a media perspective, not from a political, I'm speaking about the states mainly, not from a political perspective, not from a diplomatic perspective, not from a civil society perspective. A couple examples. From a civil society perspective, I've been out of the States for 25 years. What happened during the last 25 years is earth-shattering. It is unbelievable where the US was from a civil society perspective and where they are today. When I was 25 years ago active in the States, there was one voice for the Jewish pro-Israeli community. It was AIPAC. Today, there's a menu of organizations with all different flavors, from Jewish Voice for Peace to J Street to many others, who are able to engage in this issue with different flavors of how they approach it. It is no longer a monotone when you speak about this within the Jewish community. That's important. Another example would be solidarity, the solidarity movement. BDS movement has done wonders to bring the issue to the forefront. BDS, I believe, has one major flaw, like most of our solidarity movement activities. It's an effort which refuses to identify with an end game. If you hold Israel accountable for their violations without defining an end game, then you become a policeman. You're trying to hold somebody accountable, and you let the judge decide if they're guilty or not. We are not a policeman to Israel or anyone else for that matter. We are in a political conflict. Any element of resistance, nonviolent I would hope, in our community has to articulate a political endgame if we're serious about wanting to find a resolution to the conflict. Okay, so that's the ecosystem that we're working in, a very, very difficult one. Now, to move to Trump. To me, Trump is a clown. You said it better. He's empty-headed. That's very diplomatic. He's a clown. I don't think Trump is the issue, nor do I think his deal-making ethos is what we need to be worried about. I believe the biggest threat to Trump today is the Republican Party, because he was the vehicle that brought the Republican Party back to power. Amazing how he did it. Racism, sexism, xenophobia, Muslimphobia, Islamophobia, all the things all the phobias out there he used to bring the Republicans to power. Today, post being elected, the greatest threat to the Republican Party is Trump himself. So one of two things I think will happen. He will either learn very quickly that when you're the president of the United States, you're only the president of the United States. The system in the US, and I say this hoping that it's still true, is much stronger than the individuals that come through it. We saw that with the first Bush administration, Bush Jr. He wasn't even able to make a full sentence for 2 years, but he was still president. If he learns the game, he may stay where he's at and send Twitters every day, and the whole media world will talk about his Twitters. But the state, the establishment, the deep state, is much more than Trump's art-making book. The deep state is very clear where it stands on our issue. And I'm going to go through very, very quickly the historic record, just so we can keep it in mind. Truman, as Kerry reminded us in his December speech, 7 minutes after Israel was declared, recognized it. Kennedy talked about Israel as a special relationship, but not exclusive. He understood that the region, Saudi Arabia mainly, also needs to be an ally. Johnson spoke about shared values. Nixon spoke about we won't fight their wars, but we'll support them and arm them. Then 1973 war came, and basically they started to have this shuttle where they served arms galore, shuttle, I forgot what they call it, air shuttle to serve Israel's arms needs during that war. Then came Carter, and he said that there's a special relationship, but within a regional context, and he talked about Palestinian homeland, that there needs to be a solution for this sore spot within the region. Moving on, Reagan came, talked about a strategic partnership with Israel, and introduced loan guarantees to support Israel. Then came Bush Sr., introduced the issue in a very clear way about a Jewish state, and then also used the loan guarantees to force Shamir to come to the Madrid conference. Then came Clinton. We all know what happened there. Camp David failure, the Clinton parameters. Bush Jr. issued guarantees to Sharon, guarantees that Netanyahu is using today to say that he interprets those to mean that settlements can continue to be built. And then 9/11 came, and terrorism and the whole issue of security overwhelmed the administration and the global community, and that served Israel very well. Then came Obama. Obama, who's getting the biggest amount of heat from the Israeli side. Almost, they want to, label him anti-Semitic. I think they may have in some of the statements. The facts don't line up. Obama has been, and I'm sure we're all reading the same materials that are out there, the most loyal, the most strategic, both in arms, both in security cooperation, and of course in money, with the $38 billion agreement that just came through. However, he did something which Israel couldn't swallow. Allowing Resolution 2334 to pass doesn't match those very supportive elements of his presidency. Why? I don't think it's because Obama one day woke up and said, those poor Palestinians, we really should support them. They have rights and they've been on the wrong side of the equation. That's not the US. I believe that the US started to act publicly, and the only time you can act publicly on this issue in the US is after elections of your second term. Those 20 or 30 days is the window to act. Otherwise, you pay a huge political price, given this issue is not a foreign issue in the US, it's a domestic issue. So he acted. He acted in the service of Israel. He acted to save Israel from itself. Why? Because I believe the institution of the United States, not necessarily the president only, sees very well that Israel is driving drunk on power and is about to fall off the cliff. And the cliff has a name to it. It's called two states. And I believe they also understand that we Palestinians can live in any political arrangement that the politicians agree to. Actually, we would prefer one state if it was a choice on a menu. If you stop Palestinians and open their shirts, you'll find many have a map of Palestine. It's not the West Bank and Gaza strung together with a rubber band. It's the historic British mandated state of Palestine. That's where our heart is. But our minds have politically matured to fall in line with international law and accept two states. They see the two-state option. The US sees the two-state option about to be lost, and thus that's why I think they acted. But even when they acted, they couldn't act more than what they did without the Democratic Party paying a price. So they acted as an administration, but when the 70 countries came together in the UK in Paris the other day, they couldn't follow through with that to translate what they know and now have articulated into policy. What would that have looked like? And I wrote about this a day before the conference. What would that have looked like if they were serious about the rhetoric of two states? It would have looked like recognition of Palestine. It would have brought 138 countries plus all the rest forward to confirm the recognition of the other part of the two-state equation. And what that would have done, and still I think that should be done, it would normalize how third states view the two parties. Clearly, the international community is not able to solve it. Clearly, we, alone with the Israelis, are not able to solve it. So I believe there's a responsibility for third states 50 years later to actually normalize how they view the two states politically, both with 3 borders defined and 1 shared border undefined. It's exactly how Israel is defined today, and they were able to get recognition 7 minutes after announcing the state back in 1948. Isn't it time 50 years later that we do the same as third states to the Palestinian side? And then call for negotiations for all the issues that do have to be negotiated. To close, so what's changing, in my opinion, with Trump coming in is not the policy. The policy of the US has been clearly, blindly in support of the state of Israel, diplomatically, politically, on the international arena, even with the settlements. If we go and if we chart the wording about settlements, it keeps going down and down and down. At one point it was illegal, then it became illegitimate, then it became a barrier to peace, then it becomes complicated. It becomes, the wording has been watered down. That's the US. And I don't believe the US is about to do an about face and get on the right side of history. So Trump can tweet as much as he wants, but at the end of the day, this conflict is a deep one within the institution called the United States, and their decision has been made a long time ago. So I end with a very important question to my own community and to my own leadership. What is it that we want from the US? Is all of our work in addressing the US and addressing Trump and going back and forth to the White House? During the Clinton years, it was the most visited entity that went to the White House were the Palestinians. What do we want from them? I don't believe we want an about face. I think we want to push back against what the support that that Israel is getting from the US, to push back, to give an opening for third states to act. This is a third state responsibility, especially while we're under occupation. And the only way to get third states to act is to expose what Israel is doing more and more within the US community, so they have a harder time to be blindly supporting Israel. That's all we can ask for. And that goes back to the point I made earlier. To do that, we have to invest in media, in politics, in having a proper diplomatic representation in the US, et cetera, et cetera. I believe the Oslo process came. Clinton opened the doors of the White House and the State Department, and the leadership in Ramallah got all excited. They said, we have access. Now, every time we have a problem, we just fly to the State Department and we talk to them. They were thinking as if the US was another Arab country, that once you get to the president, that's it. You have solved the issue. And the US is a different kind of animal. In the US, policy is made in 50 states. It culminates in Washington, D.C. If you're serious about the US, you have to invest in the 50 states. And I say that without any illusion that we can create a AIPAC-like organization. We can't. We don't have the organization, we don't have the money, we don't have the insight. But we don't need an AIPAC-like organization, because the communities in the US, as we've seen during the last 25 years, are growing in support of Palestinians and Palestinian statehood. How do we translate that into policy? It requires real work. It's not going to happen by itself. Thank you.
So back to the mention made by Sambaou on recognition. So as it was mentioned, we have today, I think, more than 138 countries that have decided already to recognize Palestine as a state. What besides symbolism, and I don't underestimate the impact of symbolism and in the diplomatic arena, what besides symbolism would have as an effect recognition by the countries, mainly in EU, that have not yet recognized Palestine? On a concrete, let's say, on the concrete aspect of the negotiation of the peace prospect, do you see it as changing completely the game in your relation with Israel? Do you think that it may really help peace to become a more realistic perspective? I personally, of course, clearly understand the symbol, and it may have an impact, of course, especially at a time when other actors like the US are on a completely other track. But I think I would like to know more about the impact you see of such a gesture on the side of EU countries.